welcome, a very warm welcome to all of you, but of course a very particular welcome to our three artists who are gathered here today. And we're sitting right in the midst of Brett McMahon's work. Michelle Cawthorn's work is right next door in the gallery. I'm sure most of you have visited Michelle's work as well. And in the OLSEN annex, Janis Clarke's work is hanging. It's actually Janis' last day today after a wonderful period of exhibiting for the last couple of weeks or so. So on the off chance that you haven't been around to the annex to have a look at Janis' work, please do make sure that you do that today before the exhibition concludes, and especially after you've had the opportunity to hear a bit from Janis, which you will be doing very shortly. So a very warm welcome to all three of our artists, and exactly as Tim said, what a wonderfully diverse bunch of artists they are. Really different works, but really intriguing people. So let's begin perhaps by exploring just a little with each of the artists the broad theme or approach to each of their exhibitions. And Michelle, first of all, turning to you with your work, which very broadly is focused around that slightly magical, mystical concept of amulets and talismans. So can you give us a sense of the importance of amulets and talismans and how they've appeared in this body of work?
Hello, is that on? Yeah. So this body of work is a little bit of a departure from the way I normally work. I usually engage with memory and personal experience to draw on motifs in my practice. But last year I hit a bit of a massive creative block, let's say, too.
They happen to the best.
Which was fueled by a range of factors, and I really just needed to start art making, and as you might notice next door if you pop in there and have a look, my work is really defined by this very meditative, repetitive mark. And I just needed to focus on art making last year, so I put together a grid-like structure, and I started to build these forms, and very quickly they started to talk to me of amulets and talismans, and they really drew me out of that dark space I was in last year. So they really felt to me like the forms that were coming out were very protective. They became really imbued with quite a lot of symbolic importance for me. So that's the nexus.
A sort of intrinsic positivity, I think, is what we all feel about amulets. There's something magically good about them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, an amulet or a talisman, I mean, they're designed, or the idea of them is to ward off evil, to protect the wearer or the bearer. One of the things when I was doing some research around it is that I was surprised to learn that an amulet can also be a drawing. I had no idea. I always thought of it as something that you could hold or you could wear. But when I found out that it was also a drawing, it felt incredibly, simpatico about it. It just felt like this was very much where I was meant to be with the work at that time. And so the culmination of that for me is the sculptural work on the end wall.
Well, we'll come back to hearing about how that happened and more about that particular work in a minute or two. But moving on, Brett, to this work that we're surrounded by, which perhaps just at very first cursory glance people might assume is simply abstract. But you are a runner, and I know that you run around various parts where there are things that you observe and absorb in your process of exercise, which then can find their way into these works. So how do these works connect to things that you've seen?
Well, I was always used to spend a lot of time in the ocean, surfing, because I always enjoyed, doing something physical. But with 3 kids and my wife's business and my own practice, bobbing around in the ocean for 3 hours, just seemed sort of decadent, and it was stressful. So all I would do is think about all the things I should be doing. So as a way of keeping moving and doing something physical, I started running, and not really anything I've done before, but I think I read. You may know that Murakami wrote a book about running, and I was reading that. And I thought, well, yeah, maybe I could do that as well. So I started running, and I started doing it really late in the evening or early in the morning, so people couldn't see this middle-aged man just struggling around the streets. But what I discovered when I was doing that, it was actually it was quite beautiful, quite cinematic. And I would come back from my run just full of imagery and then the repetition of that. You would go past similar things, each day, and they'd started to really kind of the things that were of interest would stick in your mind, And so I would take those things into the studio. So whether that was lines of graffiti or a structure from a building site, I just ended up with this kind of library of structures and images, and I started putting them together in these big works on paper. So you can kind of see how they're put together in a slightly collage style kind of constructed way, and almost built in a way. And so that's the way they come about. Similarly, the big works you see on the left, the black and silver pieces, they evolved from a similar process, but that was me running down along the harbour early in the morning, late at night, and having these similar shapes reflected in the water, so they have a slightly different feel, even though the motifs you can see having a dialogue with each other. And that's how I got the idea of the name for the show, which was running through similar spaces, but the different experience that you get when you're moving through that space in the day and as compared to the evening.
And Yanni, we've just heard from Brett about that process of observation, as he is a very active person in the environment. But in your very beautiful exhibition in the annex, there is more of a sense of very still, quiet observation, but you are very much an observer, a looker, a capturer of still moments. Can you tell us a little about that process for you?
So it's interesting using that word observe, because it sort of denotes a plein air sort of connotation or something, which is not the way I work at all. I do observe, but in the same way that every other person observes. So I walk through the world and see things, and some things stick more than others. And what generally happens with me is I'll encounter something, anything. It doesn't have to be a particular style of thing, or like a landscape, or any particular object. Can be anything at all. It can be the back of somebody's head. It can be anything. But if it sticks with me, then I take that away with me and let it kind of marinate in my brain for a while, and then I'll work on other things, and eventually the images that keep coming back to me are the ones that I sort of decide to commit to and look into and start working out if it's a painting, if it could be a painting. And so in that sense, yes, I am an observer, but it's not about looking at things and then painting them directly. It's more about looking at things and letting them sit in your mind for a while, and then the process begins of trying to create it. And for me, that works in a number of ways. I use images as references to try and trigger, or to try and sort of tap into what that memory was, and then I do little works on paper, and then I edit those little works and edit them again, and just keep editing and redoing them until it's kind of reduced down to a sort of synthesized, succinct kind of image that does something. And it's usually not the same thing as what the feeling was initially. It's usually something different, but that's become sort of more interesting through the process, and I'll stick with that. And that's how it works.
It's such an insight being able to hear, as we have just heard from Jani, that step-by-step approach to seeing, thinking, analysing, coming to conclusions, making studies, beginning a work itself. The process is always, or often, so much more than perhaps the single steps that occupy most of our daily lives. And going back now to this process of the making of works, Michelle, you commented earlier that there was very much a sense as you started to think about amulets, or as they evolved in your thinking, of having a kind of grid-like construction that you've been working with. Can you give us some idea of how you go about the process of the very intricate designs that you have concluded with?
So I'm going to just preface it by saying that when I left school I did architecture for a couple of years, so I think more and more as I've got older I can see where that original training has come to sort of infuse the thinking in a very unconscious way.
In a kind of structural way?
Yeah,
that you're dealing with structures?
I do. I often think of the sculpture work as structures as opposed to sculptures. Does that make sense? But each of the drawings that you see next door, they actually all start as a really quick sketch. So as I'm trying to get a sense of the feeling of the amulet shape that's coming out, I'm letting that flow out really quickly and organically, if that makes sense. So that is not done with graph paper or any of those sorts of things. I keep art journals, and in them they have my thinking, thoughts, writing, and all of the sketches for all of the works next door. Then the next process is to then work those up. So I do a very simple grid. By that I mean it's literally I create a box or a rectangular form. I put either, as you'll notice in the end, there's either a cross going diagonally or vertically, horizontally, and from that I was then trying to build those forms. I was really wanting for this show for there to be symmetry, but within that symmetry, if you spend a bit of time with them, you'll notice that there might be three that are formed in one way and one that's formed differently. So I'm just trying to play around with that symmetry a little bit so that it doesn't feel too balanced, because I think when things have too much symmetry, it can feel off, if that makes sense. So that's the process of arriving to those forms.
And just quickly going back to you again, Jani, when you were talking about that process of your work not being like plein air, when somebody goes out, they see what's immediately in front of them, and they then capture that entire vision. As people will see when they have visited or will visit your exhibition, there is a sense, how can one describe it, of very carefully decided crops of what you see, very precisely delineated segments of vision, the corner of a tree intersecting with part of a sky, or part of a moon above a house, or even part of a face. How does that process of deciding which part of what you've observed ends up in your work happen?
Yeah, it's probably, it's like a combination of things. The first part of that thing is really sort of intuitive. Like, there's a sort of sense that I know when it's there or when it's not there. And it's just a process of kind of working, getting to that point where the way things are arranged do what I kind of like them to do, or are doing something that I didn't expect, and I now like it. But often those sort of very specific little moments, I feel like that's kind of how seeing works in a way. I mean, often you can look at a place or a thing and see there's so much information there, but often when there's a feeling associated with the thing you're looking at, it's often quite specific. It can be pinpointed down, at least for me anyway, to maybe one or two elements. Like there's a painting called Dust Stop Blues, which is in my show, which is, as you say, this like side of a tree with the sun kind of coming through, and that came from a very specific moment where I was in my day job, had a pretty annoying day, and got off the bus feeling a bit dejected, and then immediately looked up and saw that, and it just was a little reminder. It was like, oh, there's a universe out there, and this doesn't happen. So it was nice to sort of capture that in a painting. I thought, and that's the same with almost all of my paintings. There's usually a sort of emotional connection to that moment, even though I may have arrived there through a process. The reason I've kept it is because the emotional content is there for me. It may not be there for anyone else, but it's there for me. So
Yes, and it's the distillation of that emotional content in that particular crop of vision that you've managed to capture.
Well, it's about getting rid of the superfluous kind of information that wouldn't help. It wouldn't help that feeling. It wouldn't enhance it in any way. I feel like you can get caught up in all of those details, and they're sort of not important to me. Like, I want it to be immediate. I want it to be very clear. I want it to be. When I say clear, it's still mysterious because you won't get the feeling that I'm trying to capture sometimes immediately, but the image is sort of still able to be read in a way that can tell you something. So I don't know if that makes sense. But
It certainly makes sense, yes. Brett, you were describing to us the various elements, quite numerous elements, from your observations that have been incorporated into, in particular, these works on paper. And I know in a previous conversation you and I have had, you described these works on paper as really being the engine room of this exhibition. But as you make those various observations and you bring them to the paper, and this is something I would urge everybody to do if you hadn't had a chance before, one looks at the diversity of those marks and surfaces, and as you look at it broadly, there are quite strong, firm graphic elements, but as you get closer and closer, there's lots of textural interplay, even really small scratched marks here and there. How do you manage to bring all of those things together and decide which you are going to incorporate in the final work? How exploratory is that? Does it evolve as you actually make the work?
Well, it's, as I said, I end up with like almost like a mental catalogue of images and surfaces. I do have a notebook, which I'm always dragging around with me, and I record things, but that's usually just in black ink. But they're just enough to trigger the memory of something. And I guess the other thing about this body of work, I've been working long enough that I've actually sort of moved through a body of work similar to this a long time ago. And so in a way, I'm cycling back and picking that work up again and taking it somewhere forward. I guess in a way that my process tends to be quite dynamistic. So wherever I'm living and whatever I'm doing, that sort of tends to be feeding into the work that I'm making. So this kind of like lifestyle change and me sort of running around was kind of put me in an environment where I'm seeing all this material. So then the work is kind of moved in that way.
When you mention circling back in a way, referring to past work, but it does seem, for example, it feels as though there's a connection between some of the motifs that you have generated in these exploratory works and some of the motifs writ larger but perhaps more simply in these works. Do you tend to have that conscious connection between the different gestures?
Yeah, definitely. But it often is the same element, So there's one thing that comes to mind, which is the black marks in this first work on paper here, which we kind of like down near the fishing boats. There's lots of different pipes and different elements around there. So that was a drawing of some of these other things that's lying on the floor, lying on the ground, is arcs of pipe, and then in this big piece here, there was another bunch of those pipes which are sort of connected, and they're then reflected into the water. So I guess I'm always sort of looking at these kind of different connections. I think I like that process of seeing, just connections, visual connections between different forms. Sometimes looking back towards art of a different era, and underlying a lot of the composition of a lot of these works is my long-time appreciation of Japanese woodblocks. And one funny little thing I'll note is that down the back of the room, there's two small white pieces, which are paintings are reflecting on sails reflecting the water, but they're actually drawn from the eboshi hats in Japanese woodblock prints. So I've got a whole set of these things which are kind of connecting back to those and then seeing them in the environment and that sort of interplay. So I guess I do my work generally has this kind of circular kind of referential space between what I'm seeing now and then what's also in my past and in my references. I really enjoy that sort of interplay.
Mm. So there's a real sense of connection and continuity through a body of work over many years.
Yeah, I think they used to confuse me for a while. I felt kind of very dispersed. But I started, I picked up a book a long time ago, which is W.G. Sebald's Rings of Saturn. And I read and I reread that book over and over again, where he does a circular walking tour through the south of England, connecting history and the present, real history and fictionalized history, and I can use that as my excuse.
A very good excuse. Let's shift now briefly to materials, but just before I do ask about some of the materials that the different artists use, let me just say that there will be a brief opportunity once we've had our chat up here at the front for you to be part of the conversation, if you would like to be. So if there are things that you think you might like to ask any of our artists, please do start that process ticking through your mind, because we'd love to hear from you and love you to be able to put your questions to them very shortly. So just coming back to materials, Michelle, obviously there are works on paper next door, but there is also the sculptural work, and perhaps you could describe those materials. There's an installation work as well, and I know from past exhibitions of yours there have been large soft sculptures. How do you feel about the decision of what sort of material you're going to create a work in?
That's a really good question. I've always worked with sculptural elements in my practice. Again, I think it's that I often think of my drawings as in 3 dimensions when I'm making them. So right from the very beginning of the body of work, some forms are starting to feel like they need to push beyond a 2-dimensional plane. And the work that's on the end wall in this exhibition, Amulet, was a very key. I've drawn that particular work, or I should say, I've drawn it 4 times and I've made 1 sculpture of it. So that's had this, actually no, 5 if you count the initial sketch. So it's had this really big process of thinking and moving. And in the past I've made some works with soft sculpture. I think that's a legacy of having grown up in the country and having done a lot of sewing and crocheting and knitting and hand things, which I was taught by my grandmothers, particularly my mum's mum. And so there's a very natural feeling and understanding for how materials work and how you can build structural forms with them. It's a very kind of intuitive, organic process in that respect when I'm sort of thinking about what forms will become sculptures. I've also worked with a lot of plywood as well in the past, and when again, that's that sort of structural, you know, building material kind of element coming through. But for this one, the work that's at the end, this was actually my first collaboration with urban art projects. So they help artists to realise their ideas into 3 dimension, into sculptural form. They often do public works. And I approached them and said, look, I've got this idea for this work, and I don't want to do it in ways I've done before, but I don't have the skills in metalwork to do this. Can we do something together? And
Because this is an aluminium sculpture, isn't it?
correct, yeah. So it's etched aluminium, and it's actually finished with automotive paint. So these are materials that I don't normally work with, and so part of that process was extremely stimulating to be able to work with professionals who had skills in areas that I don't, to come together with my skills and to arrive at that work. The thing that I was most impressed about was the way that they could take my mark and translate that as that etched mark into that sculptural form. I was so excited to see that evolve. So yeah.
And moving down in terms of materials now, and back to you, Jani, just briefly. Obviously your principal material, as we see in the exhibition, is paint. But I've seen video of you painting, and one of the things that people may notice as they look closely at your works in the exhibition is that there is a lovely, very subtle sense of the deliberate paint marks and textures that you leave on the surface. And watching the video of you painting, it's almost like watching somebody caressing a surface with paint. There is, perhaps this is just my reaction, but it wasn't just putting paint on. It was almost a loving process, was my emotional response to watching it. How would you describe the process of so carefully deciding where to put paint in relatively simple spaces?
It's an interesting observation, because for me it doesn't feel careful. At all.
It's lovely to be so wrong.
I mean, I guess that sort of lovingly applied surface, it's not entirely accurate. I mean, like, at times I don't really think about it, is what I'm trying to say. Once I start putting the paint on the surface, I don't think too much. It's just movement, just moving the brush around, and whatever happens, happens. And you just sort of move from moment to moment and respond intuitively and keep going until you step back after a while and go, okay, something's happening here.
I mean,
now we'll keep going.
Can I just say this is one of those really fascinating things about being able to go to exhibitions and look closely at an artist's work and have one's own response. And don't we all do this? Where something speaks to us in a particular way because of maybe who we are, but isn't it wonderful then to be able to have the conversation with the artist who makes the work and find, in this case, that actually it's completely different. That's such a joy.
Well,
it's so fascinating.
It's not without love, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, like, anyone who makes paintings will tell you it's not like this luxurious kind of pastime where you're drinking a glass of wine and sort of lounging around and doing a mark here and then standing back, and it's hard work, getting to the point, especially with my practice, getting to the point where you're actually painting is, and I have a small child, so I can only paint at night, and when I go to the studio, it's with absolute intensity. I do not go there to muck around. Like, if I'm going to make a painting, I'm going to do it that night, I'm going to finish it that night, and that's it, because I don't know when I'll be back. You might get sick or something, and then you've lost like 4 weeks or 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever, but you don't want to lose that feeling. If you're ready to paint the painting, you go and do it, and that's the approach I take. It's sort of like do or die. So it doesn't come at, like, maybe it comes across as loving, but there's certainly underlying intensity to how the work is made, and I pay particular attention to, obviously colours that I'm using. They have to be working, they have to sing before I even start painting. So I spend a lot of time working on that. Preparing the surface that I'm going to paint on, that takes a lot of time. It's like a 3-step process before I can even put paint on the surface. And then when I am painting, it's a very careful kind of consideration of where I put paint and where I don't put paint, and where edges meet and those sorts of things, and how much of the substrate can be seen, how much cannot be seen, how much paint I use, whether it's extremely thin, extremely thick. Those are all sort of decisions that I make, but they are also somewhat intuitive as well. Like as the painting unfolds, I go, no, that section needs to be thin. And I don't know why that is. But as I said, it's intuitive. You just look at it and say, yeah, it's sort of like playing music. It's just getting all the right notes. Getting to the point where it's like, you've made it a piece.
It's a beautiful description. And as we've been exploring, Brett, the approach that Janis taken, I know that with some of these large works here, your approach to the paint has been quite abrasive. You've actually used an orbital sander in part on some of these works. So how is the materiality and your relationship with material for you? How do you, again, make the decision of what you're going to do? I know sometimes, not in this exhibition, but in past works, you've carved wood, you've had large pieces of fabric or other sculptural elements here. You've got wooden sculptural and painted elements. How's the material decision for you?
Well, I guess one thing I would say is that I often I like making tools to paint with. So almost like big set squares or French curves, or so often you'll see some of these lines or some of these shapes. They're maybe there's all sorts of different approaches. I guess that they're I said before that the paintings are almost like they're built. So in a way, like I have, there's a variety of different ways of putting the paint on, and so I use different elements. And a sculpture like this one here, behind, really came out of the fact that the tool that I made to make some of those shapes was actually looking better than the paintings that I was making. So I thought, well, the tool then became the artwork. So I think after a while you just gotta take it wherever you can get it. If the tooling work is good, that's great. If the tools are looking better, then well, that's good enough. I think that with the large work with the sanding, I really wanted to push the image, almost like into the fabric. I really I love paper and with the linen, which is these pictures are painted on. I really wanted to have that sense of the image was really pushed back into that fabric.
It's interesting because if you have the opportunity after the chat, if you look really closely at the weave, you can actually see, even in some of the areas that are quite dark, that the really dark paint is slightly lower than the top of the weave. So where you've sanded, you can actually just see where the paint has come off. It's microscopic, but it's visible close up, and that really close exploration is so satisfying to do. So I'd urge you to do that afterwards as well.
I used to use linen that was a lot heavier than that, and that weave was more pronounced. But in a way, it sort of ran a bit too much interference between the spatial aspects of the painting. So I kind of think that I guess the heightened sort of illusionistic element of these works, because that linen is I've gone back to a finer grained linen. So and you can also, I guess, see that there's there's references to old photographs and things like that. As I said, there's always a big swirling kind of mass of things which are feeding in and out of the work I'm doing. And as I think maybe that's just a byproduct of being old. I've made lots of things over a long time, and there's always something from the past really in there somewhere to help. You know, to be really good to help solve a problem.
Well, it's a lovely phrase, that big swirling mass of things. And I think what we've discovered in our conversation this morning is that there have been a big swirling mass of possible subjects and insights and methodologies and inspirations that we've heard from our three artists already. We could endlessly chat, as you can tell. Thank you. Well, look, what wonderful observations, and thank you all for the questions as well. There are so many things we've explored, and I think we've probably all, very much myself included, learned new things from being able to hear direct from our three artists today. But that is one of the wonderful things about visiting exhibitions in person, not just looking online, but actually being there. You often discover something new and something unexpected. And I'd like to conclude by just saying this is actually not a visual thing that I've enjoyed finding in one of these three exhibitions. In Janis' exhibition, you have the most beautiful title to one of your works, which is a word I'd never heard before, but is a beautiful word. And it's apricity. And it is the sensation of warm winter sun on your skin. And it's a beautiful word that obviously resonates here as well. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, please do thank our wonderful three artists.